covered different aspects of neoplasia in last 5 lectures. Let us just brush up what we have seen in last lecture. We had started with molecular basis of neoplasm, where we had seen 4 different categories of genes which are affected that lead to mutations in the cell, and the cell gets converted to a neoplastic cell. So the 4 major categories of genes that we had seen. The first category was growth promoting proto-oncogenes. So these are dominant of genes. So even a mutation in a single gene will lead to a permanent mutation and expression of that gene, which again had different levels of acting of these genes, like from growth factor receptor, transduction protein, nuclear regulatory proteins, and cell cycle regulators. Accordingly, we had second group of genes that are your growth inhibiting tumor suppressor genes, which are recessive in nature. So we need a mutation in both the alleles before it actually manifests itself as a mutated gene, helping for formation of a neoplasm. The third group of genes were genes regulating apoptosis. So we have pro-apoptotic and anti-apoptotic genes, and if the balance between these two is lost, and if anti-apoptotic are more activated, again they support neoplasm. The fourth category of these genes was DNA repair genes, again recessive kind of genes, and most of the defects in DNA repair genes, they are what we can say autosomal recessive kind of disorders. But by God's grace, we have very few genetically decided tumors in our body. And then we started to see the molecular mechanisms by different methods which actually cause these gene mutations. So we had covered 2 of them. One was chemical carcinogens. So where we had 2 broad categories of chemicals like direct acting and indirect acting. So direct acting are those chemicals where they don't require metabolic conversion in the body. Indirect acting as such, the pure form of chemical is not a carcinogen, but in the body it gets metabolized and the intermediate metabolite starts acting like a carcinogen. And the second way of carcinogenesis, that was physical carcinogenesis, where radiation plays a major role, as well as physical irritation on a chronic basis. So after seeing these 2 different mechanisms of carcinogenesis, today we will move on to the third mechanism of carcinogenesis. So that is biological carcinogenesis. So what we understand by biological carcinogenesis is any kind of microorganism or organism which can cause some kind of tumor formation in a body. So broadly, we all know that all pathogens are classified into 4 broad categories like parasites, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. Of this, definitely viruses play a major role in biological carcinogenesis, but let us start first with some of the parasites like Schistosoma hematobium. Now this is a parasite which is endemic in more than 70 countries of the world. So there's a lot of burden of this infection throughout the world. So it is a trematode. Now what happens with this particular trematode is the eggs of this trematode, they go and lodge into the vessels of urinary bladder, and they keep on blocking the lymphatics, and there is intermission, rupture of the lymphatics and vessels, which lead to inflammation of bladder mucosa. So there is a repeated turnover of the bladder mucosa cells and a physical irritation. In combination, that leads to formation of a carcinoma of urinary bladder. In that again, normally our urinary bladder are lined by urothelial cells or transitional epithelium. But here you will see squamous cell carcinomas. That means first there is a metaplasia from urothelium converted to squamous epithelium, and this squamous epithelium will undergo neoplastic change. So squamous cell carcinoma in bladder or urothelial carcinoma in bladder, after chemical carcinogenesis, the second leading cause is Schistosoma hematobium parasite. Accordingly, the second parasite, that is Clonorchis sinensis, which is also called liver fluke, mainly seen in China and countries having large coastal areas. Fortunately, in India, we don't have much endemic areas for this particular fluke. Now, this fluke has a habitat within the liver, and it grows within the bile ducts. And that's why it will block and clog the bile ducts, leading to chronic irritation. and there will be increase, we can say, a turnover of bile ductal epithelial cells. That's why we can get cholangiocarcinomas formed because of these parasites. So these are very two classic examples of parasites leading to carcinogenesis. The main basis of carcinogenesis in parasites is chronic physical irritation. Coming to next category, that is fungus. In fungus, the most famous, or you can say the most noted fungus, that is Aspergillus flavus. It releases aflatoxin, and the metabolites of this aflatoxin, they are carcinogenic. So if you remember, in indirect carcinogens, aflatoxin was one of the biological carcinogenesis released by fungus. So how to recognize that whether our daily foods, they carry this toxin or not? Because this is going to come through food material. So if you see grains or millets, or for example peanuts, those which have a black coating over them, that is nothing but Aspergillus flavus fungal infection of those grains, and the toxin that is a product of the fungus that gives a black sheen to these grains. So that's why you will see that the consumption of these grains is not permitted in many countries, but in India, because of poverty, these grains, they are sold at a cheaper rate in the markets if they are infected by fungi. And that's why the lower socioeconomic strata, they have more consumption of this aflatoxin through different food materials, and that can lead to hepatocellular carcinomas. The third category, that is bacteria. In bacteria, till date, only one bacteria has been strongly associated with cancer, and that is Helicobacter pylori. Now, this is a gram-positive bacilli which is spiral shaped. Basically, it infects stomach, so it causes chronic gastritis. It leads to peptic ulcer formation, and because of multiple mechanisms, it can lead to gastric carcinomas, and it can also lead to lymphomas of the gastric mucosa, that is called mucosa-associated T-cell lymphomas. So now there are different mechanisms by which H. pylori actually causes carcinogenesis. So one is they lead to generation of lot of free radicals in a cell, that is gastric epithelium. So they lead to oxidative stress. Second is proteins like CAG-A and peptidoglycans, which are proteins of the bacteria. They enter these epithelial cells. The bacteria actually enter the gastric mucosal epithelial cells, release these chemicals, and these chemicals, they will then mutate some of our genes or overactivate some of the oncogenes. Also, they dysregulate catenins. So what are these? These are basically our adherent molecules. So if we are going to break the bonds between the cells, it will further enhance the metastasis process of these tumors. So that's why Helicobacter is thought to be causing carcinogenesis by different mechanisms. So it is not one single channel, so it is multifactorial. Coming to the next category, that is viruses. So viral oncogenesis means development of cancer because of viral infections. So normal cells, they get infected with certain viruses, and they can get transformed into cancer cells. Why? Because there is expression or activation of the viral oncogenes. So the genes which come from viral origins, they will have a suffix of V. For example, I say VRAS or I say VMYC. It means this gene is analog to the human gene, means it has similarities structure-wise to the human gene, but it has come from a viral origin. So transformation of a cell which is infected by a virus, now this can result from either the viral genes get integrated in the human DNA, or the whole genome of the virus, means all its genes get integrated into the host genome. Now what will happen? Normally we say that our DNA has 46 chromosomes. So now definitely this number of genes and chromosomes will change when a viral gene or genome will get integrated. So the cell will have now more of chromatin material, it will become hyperchromatic. Now this integration actually changes the behavior of human genes, and that leads to mutations, leading to viral oncogenesis. So in that we can broadly categorize these viruses. So now why these are oncogenic? Why some viruses are oncogenic and some are not? So till date 7 to 8 viruses have been properly proven that they cause cancers in humans. Though in animals we have a list more than 20 viruses, and it is a matter of research. Maybe down the lane in next decade, we may come up with 30, 40 viruses claiming that they cause cancers in humans. So actually what is happening, these viral genomes, they show presence of several human genes homologs, means they have similarity in structure and function similar to human genes. And that will lead to cellular transformation, converting a cell into a neoplastic cell. So as I said, for example, let us see this VMYC. So this V stands for virus. It is analog to CMYC, which is a human gene. Now this CMYC is a human oncogene, means it has been converted, a growth promoting proto-oncogene, undergoing mutation, it becomes an oncogene. Similarly, I say VIL6, now interleukin 6. If it is a gene of viral origin, we will add a suffix of V. Or else in human it is just IL6 gene, which is going to express for interleukin 6. Now if that is released in excess, it will lead to stimulation of MAP kinase and STATs, which will actually lead to formation of transcription factor activation and nucleus promoter activation. So both of them are going to give signals to the nucleus to undergo mitosis. So there is cell growth and cell survival. So this is just an example how viruses can lead to oncogenesis in cells. So as I said, we have two categories of viruses, DNA viruses and RNA viruses. And if we see the burden of cancers caused by viruses, it is significant. So 12 to 20% of the cancers worldwide are caused by viruses. So naturally, if somebody says that what are the countries where viral carcinogenesis or viral induced cancer patients are more in number, then those are the developing countries, mainly Asian and African, where the infectious diseases are more. Because the major chunk of these viral cancers are basically hepatocellular cancers caused by hepatitis B virus and C virus, and squamous cell carcinomas caused by human papillomaviruses. So because they are transmitted, they are infectious, maybe bloodborne or they are sexually transmitted. That's why the underdeveloped or developing countries have more burden of viral cancers compared to developed countries. So I hope now it is clear that the viruses which can actually convert a normal cell into a neoplastic cell are called oncogenic viruses. So we have two categories, DNA viruses and RNA viruses. So let us see them one by one. So DNA viruses, what happens with DNA viruses? Once the virus enters within a cell, let us take for example, it is a hepatocyte and a HBV virus has entered the hepatocyte. So the genome of this virus will get integrated into the host cell, means it will become a part of the hepatocyte DNA. Now this forms a stable association, okay? And whenever this hepatocyte will go in replication, the virus replicates along with that, and it forms n number of copies. It will burst the cell and it will come out. So it has killed the hepatocyte. Now in normal circumstances, this is what is a viral replication cycle. But when I say it gets integrated, now instead of forming multiple copies, it will just multiply with the DNA of the cell and it will lead to mutations. So here the cell is not dying. So this we can just see through a diagrammatic representation, same thing. So there's a DNA virus with an envelope. It binds to a host cell. It enters the host cell. In normal circumstances, this DNA virus uses the human DNA machinery to replicate, and once it forms n number of copies, it will come out, burst the cell and come in the circulation affecting other cells. So this is normal viral cycle. Now in say that each and every patient of hepatitis B or C should get a hepatocellular carcinoma. So actually it is less than 1% of patients who develop hepatocellular carcinomas. So in them, instead of going in replication phase, this viral genome gets integrated into the cell nucleus and it becomes a part of a human DNA. So this increases the chromatin material and it will increase the NC ratio and it will now transform our normal genes into oncogenes and the cell becomes a neoplastic cell. So here what we understand, one thing basically is what all mechanisms till now we have seen for carcinogenesis The viral oncogenesis has a completely different mechanism. Why? Because here the genes of virus are getting integrated in our DNA, and these genes, they are acting like oncogenes. Why? Because they are homologs to human genes. Also, the site where they bind may activate, overactivate even our normal genes, forcing the cell to undergo proliferation. So now let us see the examples of DNA viruses which are oncogenic. Now these are very commonly asked questions in universities, that what is viral oncogenesis, or enumerate some viruses that lead to cancers in humans. So let us see first few DNA viruses. The first group, that is human papillomavirus, that are papoviruses. What we are dealing are DNA viruses. Now this HPV is one of the most common cancer causing virus in humans. So there are n number of strains of HPV. So few of these strains will cause benign tumors, that is papillomas. So if you remember, the first lecture I had said that a multi-layered epithelium like transitional or a squamous epithelium, when it forms a benign tumor, you call it papilloma. When a single layer epithelium forming glands forms a benign tumor, you call them adenomas. So papillomas are seen in skin, genital areas and larynx because of HPV infection. Some of the other strains of HPV can form squamous cell carcinomas. Most common, of course, is cervix and then anogenital areas and oropharynx, larynx. Then other viruses of the same group like papillomavirus or polyomavirus or SV40 virus, they are affecting many animals. So experimentally, they have been proven to cause cancers in animals, but not yet in humans. So they cause carcinomas, sarcomas. In humans, SV40 virus has been studied that whether it is associated with mesothelioma. So maybe in future, we may prove this association of this particular tumor. The second group of viruses that are herpes viruses, in that again Epstein-Barr virus causing mainly Burkitt's lymphoma, nasopharyngeal carcinomas in humans. Second is human herpes virus 8 that causes Kaposi sarcoma and B-cell lymphoma. The Kaposi sarcoma is very strongly associated with HIV patients, and it is nothing but a vessel sarcoma affecting mainly skin. So in India, Kaposi sarcoma incidence is very low, but in African countries, Kaposi sarcoma presentation is very common in HIV patients. Third group of viruses, that is adenoviruses. Fortunately, adenoviruses don't cause any cancers in humans, but they cause cancers in hamsters like sarcomas, in rabbits. We get pox viruses, that is fourth category. In humans, pox virus cause molluscum contagiosum and papillomas. So molluscum contagiosum, as the name suggests, they are contagious. So they are basically causing papillomas, which are of viral origin. And you get eosinophilic globules within the cytoplasm of cell, which are called molluscum bodies. So these are infectious. That's why you will see that people say that if some patient develops viral warts and he keeps on touching that area, he develops a wart on other arm as well, or other fingers or digits. So this is because of transmission of the virus from one part of epithelium to another. And the fifth, that is very classic example of DNA virus oncogenesis, that is B virus. It causes hepatocellular carcinoma in humans. And as I said, less than 1% of people who are infected by HBV will actually go into the phase of hepatocellular carcinomas. Then coming to human papillomavirus, as I said, this is one of the viruses having a lot of different substrains. So 70 genetically distinct types of human papillomaviruses have been isolated, and of these, they are implicated in genesis of carcinoma of cervix, anogenital regions, oral and laryngeal. So the skin other than genital areas is generally not associated with HPV infection. So this you have to understand, that HPV is transmitted sexually. That's why anogenital regions, oral and laryngeal areas, these are the areas where we have a strong association of HPV infection with occurrence of squamous cell carcinomas. But if someone says there's a squamous cell carcinoma on face or neck area or on limbs, so there we fail to demonstrate human papillomavirus. Okay. Then in this, a simple algorithm to remember is the HPV which have a strain number less than 10, or even if it is double digit within 15, generally cause benign tumors of squamous epithelium, that is papillomas. So HPV 1, 4, 2 and 7, they cause squamous cell papillomas. Similarly, HPV 6 and 11, they cause warts. Now warts are again papillomas, but they are because of viral origin, they involve genitals. Opposite to that, squamous cell carcinoma of cervix, for example, it is caused by human papillomavirus 16 and 18. Less commonly, it is caused by HPV 31, 33, 35 and 51. So what we understand is there are many strains of HPV which lead to carcinogenesis in humans. Now, recently what we have formulated is a vaccine against HPV 16. And 16 being one of the commonest human papillomavirus leading to squamous cell carcinoma. So that's why vaccination of all the adolescent and you can say young females is recommended to at least prevent squamous cell carcinomas of cervix because of HPV. Now, how HPV works, this is just a short demonstration, not all the molecules. So the HPV genome gets integrated into the human genome, DNA. It releases two molecules called E6 and E7. This E6 molecule combines with P53. Now, what was P53? It is a guardian of our DNA. So that gets degraded. So if it is degraded, there is loss of tumor suppressor action of P53. The second molecule E7, it binds to RB. What was RB? It was a retinoblastoma gene. Because of this binding, the E2F transcription factor, which was bound to RB, is released. Now, because this is a transcription factor, it will go and act on the DNA and it will force the DNA to undergo multiplication. So, cell cycle will be activated, cell starts proliferating. So, this is one of the mechanisms which HPV adopts for causing carcinogenesis. Coming to how HPV looks. So this is a squamous epithelium multilayered, and this is a picture from papilloma. So what you can see here is, if you see these cells surrounding the nuclei, there is a big halo. So this is what is meant by coilocytosis. So coilocytic change in the epithelium is an indirect indicator that this epithelium has HPV infection. Same cells when we go for a pap smear of cervix. So if you first see these squamous cells, nucleus is small, there's abundant cytoplasm, and there's no halo surrounding the nuclei. Now see this cluster, there's a nucleomegaly, the nucleus has increased in size because of more chromatin, and there's a big halo surrounding the nucleus. So this is what we mean by coilocytic change. And this is the earliest change which we can catch on pap smear in cervical smears, so that we can put these patients on follow-up, and also we can go for PCR to detect the type of virus, whether it is 16 or 18, which are strongly associated with carcinomas. The second virus in DNA, that is Epstein-Barr virus. So now Epstein-Barr virus, it infects B cells, it can infect natural killer cells, T cells, and it can infect epithelial cells. So if it infects B cells, it is going to cause proliferation of cells leading to malignant lymphomas. So that is typical Burkitt's lymphoma. If they affect the natural killer cells, they will again lead to lymphoma of natural killer cells. If they affect the epithelium, most common is nasopharyngeal area. So they will lead to nasopharyngeal carcinomas by proliferation of these cells. So what this Epstein-Barr virus does? So let us just see a short mechanism of Epstein-Barr virus. So this Epstein-Barr virus basically attaches to the CD21, which is a receptor present on B cells. So we can say that it is complementary to the structure of CD21 molecule. Once it binds this B cell, then two genes of this virus, they get activated. That is EB NA, that is Epstein-Barr virus, nuclear antigen 2, and LAM1. What do these genes do? They will mutate the human genes, NRAS gene, and dysregulate the CMYC oncogene. So they have in one go mutated our two genes. In normal circumstances, the B cell proliferation is regulated by T cells. So what do these T cells do? They engage CD40 receptor on B cell, and they will then regulate the proliferation of B cells. Means if they are not needed, they won't allow them to proliferate. This is called immunoregulation by T cells. Unfortunately, when there is Epstein-Barr virus infection of a B cell, this immunoregulation is lost. And now, when these genes, which are growth promoter genes, get activated, the B cell will start proliferating, and then the patient will develop a lymphoma of B cells. Now, the second category of viruses are RNA viruses. So, they are basically retroviruses. They carry enzyme reverse transcriptase. This you must have learned in HIV also, which is a classic example of RNA virus. So, this reverse transcriptase virus converts a single strand of RNA, synthesize a viral DNA strand. So, initially a single strand of DNA is synthesized with the help of a reverse transcriptase enzyme. Now, this single viral DNA which has been synthesized, it acts like a template, and again a complementary second strand of DNA will be synthesized. So together now they will form a proviral DNA. So what has happened in RNA virus, there is an additional step that initially from RNA it has formed DNA. Now further this DNA will get integrated into the host cell, transform it into the neoplastic cell. So further mechanism is same as DNA viruses. So in nutshell, I can say that RNA virus has one additional mechanism for oncogenesis compared to a DNA virus. And after integration of this DNA, proviral DNA from RNA virus, the cell will start replicating. So if we see this same in a figure, then you will see that there's a RNA virus, it got infecting a cell. Let us say it is a HCV virus, again hepatitis C, which is a RNA virus, came into the hepatocyte. So it enters the nucleus of the hepatocyte. It forms a provirus. So now what it has formed? It has formed its DNA from RNA. That gets integrated into the human DNA. Now it has become a transformed DNA or a transformed cell. That means it has become a neoplastic cell. Now let us see some of the examples of this RNA viruses which lead to human tumors. There's again one more interesting fact about these RNA viruses is, suppose there's an RNA virus which has no oncogene or no human homolog gene. So it's a normal RNA, okay? It has infected our human cell. By reverse transcriptase, it has formed a proviral DNA, and that DNA gets integrated into a human DNA. Now it uses our human DNA to replicate. So it has formed n number of copies. So now the new virus form is called a recombinant virus. Why? Because it carries its own genes plus now it has added some new human genes. From where it has gained this? It has gained from the human DNA. And why it has gained? Because it got integrated into the human DNA. So virus to start with, which was not at all oncogenic, now may gain some oncogene from the human DNA. So this becomes a recombinant retrovirus. Now if this is going to infect some other patient, maybe now this will start acting like a oncogenic virus. So now this is an area of debate, and it is an area of you can say research, that can viruses transmit human oncogenes from one patient to another. So it is a matter of research. Maybe in future we will come up with solid proof for this particular transmission. So right now it is hypothesis. So that's why I won't say that it has been full proven mechanism. So let us see some of the RNA viruses. So interestingly, only two group of RNA viruses right now have been strongly associated with human tumors. Rest are associated with animal tumors. So first group is acute transforming viruses, Rous sarcoma virus seen in chickens. They can lead to sarcomas. So now here, what is the alert is, even animals can be diseased. They can have tumors. So if we are non-veg lovers or if we like to eat non-veg foods, we have to be very sure that we are not consuming diseased animals, right? Like avians, felons, or bovine or chickens, because these animals may be suffering from leukemias or sarcomas. So undercooked kind of these non-vegetarian foods may sometimes transmit these viruses to humans also, right? And right now what we are facing, the pandemic of coronavirus is again originated from bats. So we don't have to forget that we may suffer from zoonotic disease, and in future they may be even source of causing cancers. Slow transforming viruses like mouse mammary tumor virus causes leukemias, lymphomas, and breast cancers, but in mice, not in humans. So in humans, the third category of RNA virus, that is HTLV, human T cell lymphotrophic viruses. Again, they are type 1 and type 2. What they mainly cause, they cause adult T cell leukemias and lymphomas and hairy cell leukemias. So very specific tumor and very specific name. The name itself suggests that what it is going to cause. Human T cell lymphotrophic virus. Means a virus which is going to infect human T cells only. So naturally, the tumors will be of T cell origin. That's why T cell leukemias and lymphomas. The last one, that is hepatitis C virus. Now, hepatitis C virus leads to hepatocellular carcinomas. If someone asks you that what are now the oncogenic viruses which cause tumors in humans, simple to remember, there are only two RNA viruses, HTLV and HCV. Rest all viruses are DNA viruses. So let us try to remember them in this simplified way, that only two viruses are RNA, HCV and HTLV. Rest all are DNA viruses causing human cancers. Now, after seeing there's different carcinogenesis mechanisms, that was chemical carcinogenesis, physical and radiation carcinogenesis, and last is biological carcinogenesis. So here we end up with the molecular mechanisms of actually how tumors are formed in body. Now let us see some more interesting aspects of tumor. So first is, what are the effects of tumor on the host? So that depends mainly on location of the tumor and whether the tumor is benign or malignant. So let us take an example that there's a big schwannoma, benign tumor coming from Schwann cells of nerve, sitting in the retroperitoneum. Now there's ample of space to accommodate this tumor. Or there's a large cyst adenoma of ovary. So there's ample of space in the abdomen to accommodate this tumor. So it won't cause much, you can say, signs or symptoms. Opposite to that, there is a tumor sitting in the meninges, a meningioma, benign tumor of meninges. What is problem? The skull cannot expand, so it will compress our brain. So when it is compressing brain, what it is causing? Encroachment of some of the area. Now this will definitely give rise to more symptoms and signs. Imagine a small nerve-shaped tumor sitting close to the hypothalamus or close to the brainstem. Now there is barely any space there, and if a 2 centimeter size tumor develops, it will compress our cardiorespiratory centers to the extent that it can cause sudden death by cardiac arrest. So that's why now the location has changed and the effect of tumor will change. Then some tumors, if they are compressing some important part like thyroid, if it is large enough, it will compress your throat and esophagus. So patient will have difficulty in breathing, patient may have difficulty in deglutination, right? Then some tumors, they secrete hormones. So what we will have, the hormones will have their effects on different organs. So let us say there is a thyroid adenoma, it is secreting a lot of T3 and T4. The patient may come with hyperthyroidism. There is a tumor of beta islet cells. So that is insulinoma. It is secreting a lot of insulin. So patient will come with hypoglycemic attacks, right? There is an opposite tumor of glucagon secreting cells. So now patient will come with hyperglycemia, with diabetes. So the presentation will go on changing with what the tumor is elaborating. Next is if the tumor are highly vascular, they are setting superficial to the skin, maybe in the skin or maybe in the rectum or they are in the breast. Now these can erode through the mucosas, through the skin, leading to bleedings and secondary infections. They can even rupture. Sometimes large tumors may undergo infarction and necrosis. And the last, most important is, many of the sign symptoms of the tumors are because of metastasis. Now imagine there is a basic colonic carcinoma and it is causing multiple metastases in the liver. So what it will lead to? It will lead to chronic liver failure. So the patient may come with deranged LFTs, he may come with jaundice. There is a tumor metastasizing to lungs. Patient may come with breathlessness. Patient may come with repeated pneumonias. So the metastasis will also going to present differently from the primary tumor. Or there is a primary sitting in the ovary and there are metastases in brain. So patient may come with convulsions. Patient may come with stroke. So here the presentation is completely different from the primary tumor itself. Now there is a second category of disorders associated with tumors. So there is weight loss in cancer patients. We call it cachexia. Now normally if somebody is dieting or fasting, so they lose more fat compared to muscle. But in tumors it is very peculiar that the weight loss is because of losing both muscle mass as well as fat. So why it happens so? Because of three factors which are released in excess by tumor as well as the inflammatory reaction to tumors. So one is TNF-alpha, that is also called as cachexin. Second is interleukin-6. And third is PIF, that is proteolysis inducing factor. These three factors lead to emaciation, weight loss in a cancer patient despite normal diet. So that is a fact of importance. Then the second category of sign symptoms which present in this neoplasms that are called paraneoplastic syndromes. Now as the name suggests, para means associated. So when you say something is associated with, means you are trying to say it is not because of the tumor itself. So it is a secondary outcome of a tumor, which cannot be explained easily by the tumor itself or by the metastasis of tumor. Why? Because the syndrome is caused by something which is enzyme or hormone elaborated not normally by the cell of origin. Let me explain in a simple language that I say there is a hepatocellular carcinoma, right? Now we all know that hepatocytes cannot secrete erythropoietin. It has to come from juxtaglomerular apparatus of kidney. So in such patients of hepatocellular carcinoma, there is polycythemia, means excess of hemoglobin levels. And you are amazed that the blood levels of erythropoietin are high. Now you cannot explain this theory that how come a hepatocyte is secreting erythropoietin, right? So the elaboration of a hormone is not indigenous to the tissue of origin, neither it is from the distant spread of the tumor. When such signs and symptoms occur, then you call it paraneoplastic syndrome. In other language, if I say that there is hyperthyroidism in presence of a thyroid adenoma, this is not a paraneoplastic syndrome. Why? Because thyroid has to secrete T3 and T4. They will lead to hyperthyroidism. So here the tissue of origin is same from where I expect that hormone to be secreted. But the same hyperthyroidism caused by an ovarian tumor, now this becomes a paraneoplastic syndrome. I hope this is now clear. So now let us see few examples of paraneoplastic syndromes. So paraneoplastic syndromes may be the earliest manifestation of occult neoplasm. What is occult? One which is not visible, right? So is it really occult? It is not occult, but actually clinically it is not visible. Now something is sitting within the abdomen and the patient is coming with symptoms of flushing, there's tachycardia, there's diarrhea. So obviously on your palpation you don't feel any tumor. That's when you will label it as an occult neoplasm. You take help of radiology, you go for MRI, CT scan, sonography, and then you find there's some tumor sitting in colon or appendix or somewhere else in stomach. No more, it is occult neoplasm now. But to start with symptoms, the tumor has not manifested yet. The first manifestation was a paraneoplastic syndrome. So if I can catch this and I can have some suspicion, I may screen the patient further to catch the neoplasm. Then they may represent significant clinical problems and sometimes they can even be lethal. When they can be lethal, especially when they are leading to severe hypertension, which can lead to cerebral bleeds or it can lead to some vascular ruptures in heart or aortas, which can turn out to be fatal. Sometimes they can mimic metastatic disease. Okay, why? Because there's a nodule sitting in pancreas, and I take it as a primary tumor of pancreas, and patient comes with diabetes or patient comes with hypoglycemia. I relate it like that, but I fail to understand that this is not the primary tumor of pancreas, but the primary is sitting in liver, and that is releasing insulin. Okay, so now it can mimic a metastatic disease sometimes. I may take that liver tumor as a metastasis from pancreas. But unless I study these two tissues, it is difficult to say which is the primary tumor and which is metastatic. That's why it can malinger a metastatic disease sometimes. So now we will see some of the few common examples of paraneoplastic syndrome. There are n number of this, maybe more than 100. So we will just cover a few of them. Like squamous cell carcinomas or small cell carcinomas of lungs, they are very notorious. They secrete n number of enzymes and hormones which will lead to paraneoplastic syndrome. So some of them classic are like they may secrete ACTH, and this patient may come with Cushing syndrome itself. So he is not coming with lung problems, he is coming with Cushing syndrome. Okay, so now you have scanned the lung and you find a nodule in lung, and the histopathology says that this is a small cell carcinoma of lung. Similarly, the patient may secrete a lot of ADH, coming with SAIDH secretion syndrome. Sometimes the breast cancers or ovarian carcinomas, squamous cell carcinoma of lung, they may secrete parathyroid hormone. Now we all know that parathyroid has to come from parathyroid gland. So this is not their primary site to secrete this hormone. But problem is this parathyroid hormone will act on bones, lead to resorption of bone and leading to hypercalcemia. Then hepatocellular carcinoma, as I already said, they may secrete insulin, causing hypoglycemia. The small cell carcinoma of lung, ovarian and breast carcinomas, sometimes they secrete onconeural antibodies. Now this is very different from what we have seen all the rest of the examples. Here they are not secreting a hormone or neither they are secreting any enzyme. What they are forming antibodies, means they are basically secreting immunoglobulins. And what is the problem with these antibodies? They are against our neurons. So they lead to encephalitis, they lead to neuropathies, they lead to cerebral and cerebellar degenerations. So this is the only category of paraneoplastic syndromes where immunotherapies can help us to take control of the paraneoplastic syndrome or to minimize these particular effects of the antibodies. Okay. In rest of the paraneoplastic syndrome where enzyme or hormone is secreted, immunoglobulins cannot control these paraneoplastic syndromes. Then few more examples of paraneoplastic syndromes. So bronchial adenomas or pancreatic carcinomas or gastric carcinomas, they are secreting a lot of serotonin. Now we know that serotonin is normally secreted by neuroendocrine cells, but all these are epithelial cells. So that's why it will classify as a paraneoplastic syndrome. And what does that lead to? It leads to a carcinoid syndrome. So this is characterized by flushing, sweating, palpitations, momentary hypertension, diarrheal bouts. So that is what we mean by carcinoid syndrome. So carcinoid syndrome is classically seen by serotonin secretions. Okay. Then renal cell carcinomas, cerebellar hemangiomas, hepatocellular carcinomas, they are going to secrete erythropoietin. So I have already explained it will lead to polycythemia. It will act on bone marrow, cause more and more production of RBCs. So there's high levels of hemoglobin in the blood. Gastric carcinomas secreting endothelial growth factors leading to acanthosis nigricans. Bronchogenic carcinomas, what they secrete is unknown, but what they lead to is hypertrophic osteoarthropathies. Pancreatic carcinomas sometimes secrete a lot of mucin, which enters our circulation and it leads to venous thrombosis. Okay, so these are some of the examples of paraneoplastic syndromes. So after that, now we come to the last part of neoplasia, which is equally important. That what is lab diagnosis of cancers? So maybe at undergraduate level, it may be not that much significant to you, but definitely people who are practicing, whatever branch they practice, few basic methodologies they must understand, which can be adopted to diagnose cancers in time. Why? Because if I diagnose a tumor at early stage, definitely I can offer cure to the patient. But if I diagnose some tumor in stage 3 or stage 4, what will happen? It will not be in a curable stage, it will be in a treatable stage. So let us see how we go about that. So the few of the methods, the first method, that is cytologic methods. Now we can utilize different kind of techniques of cytology to diagnose a neoplasm. So I am saying neoplasm, that means both benign as well as malignant tumors. So first is called exfoliative cytology. What it means? Naturally cells are shedded in body cavities and in hollow viscous of our body. So if I collect the secretions from there, I centrifuge it and make the smears, I will get the shaded cells. The classic example of this is our pap smear, where we simply collect the shaded cells from cervix and vagina, and I can catch the earliest changes of coilocytic changes by human papillomavirus, or I can catch dysplastic changes in the epithelium. So maybe I have caught it in the carcinoma in situ phase before it has developed an infiltrating carcinoma, right? Then the scrap cytology is coming with, when you scrap your tissues like oral mucosas, you have gently scrapped the oral mucosa, so the cells will shed. Suppose there's an ulcer or a nodule, I have simply scrapped it with a slide, so some cells will shed. Again, I prepare a smear, stain it with Romanovsky stains, and see for individual morphology what we had seen in lecture 1 and 2, that whether NC ratio is high, there is hyperchromasia, nucleoli are prominent, and so on. If there is a lump which is deep-seated like breast lump or thyroid lump, or there are cervical nodes, we can do a fine needle aspiration cytology. Again, you have broken down some cells in the tissue with the help of needle, you have aspirated them, spread them, and see the smears. What is immunocytochemistry? I will explain this along with immunohistochemistry. So these are all cytological methods. Coming to histological methods, now we have different types of biopsies which can be done. So suppose there's a big mass sitting in the breast, you have incised the skin, opened it, and taken a small piece of that mass and closed it again. This is what we mean by incisional biopsy. But if the whole tissue was just 1 centimeter nodule in an oral cavity or in breast or in arm, I remove the whole thing. That is called excisional biopsy. So these two kinds of biopsy we can go for histopathology study, and we can study all the features, that whether it is a benign tumor or malignant tumor, it is a sarcoma or carcinoma, what is the type of origin, what is the grade of tumor, and so on. The third is frozen section. What do you mean by this? Now suppose there's a big ovarian mass, okay, and your radiological imaging says that this may be a benign tumor or it may be a malignant tumor. So now the surgeon is on a fix that how much radical surgery he should do, whether he should remove the uterus, cervix, both the tube ovaries along with pelvic nodes, omentum, peritoneum, or he should remove just the ovary.
So now he needs a call intraoperatively to say that whether removing ovary is a sufficient surgery or he has to go for a radical surgery. So that is when we go for a frozen section. So what we mean by frozen section is, in normal histopathology, what we do is we fix the tissue in formalin for 8 to 12 hours. We take sections of them, then we put them in tissue processing, which take another 12 to 16 hours. Then we will make a paraffin block. We will take a thin slice of that, and then we'll stain it with H&E. So this whole process is going to take between 24 to 48 hours. So my report will take at least 2 to 3 days. Now intraoperatively, I cannot go with this long process. So here what I do, I don't put the tissue in formalin. I have not fixed it. Okay. So it is put in simple saline. Now what is my motto? My motto is to cut it as thin as possible. So that's why I take a chunk of this tissue. I freeze it in a freezing microtome at minus 40 degrees Celsius. So now it becomes ice. I take 10 micron thin section of this, do a rapid H&E, and now see it under the microscope. This is what we mean by frozen section. So what is the beauty of this procedure? It will give you a diagnosis whether this is a neoplasm or inflammation. That is one thing. Second, whether it is a benign or a malignant tumor. It may not help you in subtyping because section is thick, but it will help this he needs. And this whole process will occur in just 15 to 20 minutes. And that's why we do it intraoperatively. The last, that is immunohistochemistry. What we mean by that is immunohistochemistry. Let us split it. So when you say immuno means I am checking for antigen-antibody complex formation. That is the immune complex. Okay. So what is here antigen? Let us take squamous epithelium. Now we know that squamous epithelium forms keratin. So this cell is containing keratin material. I have to stain it. I have to prove that the tumor cell contains keratin. So here the keratin acts like an antigen. I develop monoclonal antibodies within the animals outside. I purify, synthesize them from the serum of the animals to make it monoclonal antibodies. Now I take a tissue section. I pour these antibodies over the section. So if there's a keratin in the tumor cells, these antibodies will go and bind to them. So this forms an immune complex. Now this immune complex can be diagnosed with the help of third antibody against these monoclonal antibodies, which are tagged with a dye, which will give a color, right? So in step 2, I will add this another antibody with a dye. It will go and bind to this complex if at all there was a keratin. And then I will stain this slide with hematoxylin. So the background will become blue, and wherever this keratin is present, that will look brown because of the dye. So that is the concept of immunohistochemistry. So where do we apply this immunohistochemistry? Mainly, this is applied where the morphology of a tumor is undifferentiated, means it is a high-grade tumor, and I am not in a position to call that this is a squamous cell carcinoma, or it is adenocarcinoma, or it is a liposarcoma, or a fibrosarcoma, or a leiomyosarcoma. I am just in a position to say this is anaplastic carcinoma, or this is a poorly differentiated sarcoma, right? So if I say this, I have to now confirm the cell of origin. So for that, I will now target a specific filament in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus, in the cell membrane, with the help of monoclonal antibodies specific against that antigen. The second category I needed is to categorize leukemias and lymphomas. So morphologically, a bone marrow smear may show cells which may not be in a position to differentiate like myeloblast or lymphoblast. So here I will use the CD markers which are on the cell surface. So the CD marker acts like antigen. There's an antibody which will go and bind to the CD marker. Now it segregates. Okay, this is CD21 or this is CD20 or it is CD4 or CD8. So I can say this is a T cell or a B cell or a natural killer cell or a myeloblastic leukemia or lymphoma. Then sometimes you just get metastatic tumors. So there are multiple nodules in lung and liver, but primary you are unable to find. You have done a core biopsy from this metastatic nodule. So now I have seen that this is adenocarcinoma, fine, but I don't know it came from stomach or colon or from breast. So here again I will use immunohistochemistry for specific markers which will tell me the tissue of origin. The last and very important aspect for IHC nowadays is to determine the prognosis and therapeutic significance of a tumor. Like for example, it is a breast carcinoma, and I check whether these carcinoma cells, they carry estrogen progesterone receptors. If they carry, I can give a estrogen blocker drug, right? So that will block. So the effect of estrogen like a growth factor will be inhibited. If it carries another growth factor, that is ERB-B2 or also called as HER2/neu, then I can give antibodies against this particular receptor, that is Herceptin injections, and they will block this growth factor so that you halt the progress of tumor. Next is Ki-67, very interesting molecule nowadays because it basically stains the cells in mitosis. So if I say that 10% of the tumor cells have taken up Ki-67, so the growth fraction is small. I say 90% of tumor cells have stained by Ki-67, means it's very aggressive tumor. 90% cells are in mitosis. So growth fraction is very high. So let us see some of the diagrams to understand it better. So these are some of the examples of filaments which can be stained in different tumors. So keratins can be seen in carcinomas, mesotheliomas, some of the germ cells. Vimentin, again a different marker, can be seen in sarcomas, melanomas, or lymphomas. Desmin, we know all that desmin and myogenin come in muscles. So they will tell you that the tumor is of myogenic origin. Neurofilaments will tell that these are neural tumors. Glial fibrillary acidic protein will tell us that these are glial tumors, that is astrocytomas or ependymomas. And then a few more of these filaments. So this is an example of immunohistochemistry. Now this is a breast carcinoma which has been stained for HER2/neu. So what is HER2/neu? It is a growth receptor present on the tumor cells. And what we did, we took a monoclonal antibody against this receptor, stained the slide, and as I said, if there is an antigen on the cell, the dye will be taken by the cell membrane. So that's why the cell membrane are brown, stained here. And you see the nucleus there are blue. So nucleus is not having the antigen is on the cell membrane. So if you see, most of the cells have taken up the brown stain, means majority of the cells are having this Herceptin, HER2/neu receptor on their cell. So if that is present, now I can treat these patients by Herceptin injection. What are they? They are monoclonal antibodies. They will go and block this particular antibody. So it will halt the progress or multiplication of the tumor cells. Now this is Ki-67, right? What I said, Ki-67 is a marker for mitosis. So you see what has happened here, the cell nucleus is stained, not the cytoplasm, the nuclei have stained. And in this section, almost 70 to 80% nuclei stained, means the growth fraction is very high in this tumor. So this tumor will be very aggressive. So now this is going to tell us the prognosis that this is a high-grade tumor and relatively prognosis will become bad. That is how IHC can help us in prognosis also. Few more slides. So tumor markers, what do you mean by tumor marker? Something secreted by a tumor, maybe enzyme, maybe hormone, maybe some molecule that comes into the body fluids or blood. I take it, analyze it, I can say that this is secreted, I start searching for the tumor. That's one scenario. Another scenario, I already know there's a tumor of this organ. I expect that this tumor marker should come in blood. I check it in the blood. It comes in blood. I said done. This is that tumor before even I go for histopathology to prove that it is a carcinoma or sarcoma. So that is the beauty of tumor markers. So they are used as adjunct. Please mind well, they are not used as 100% diagnosis. If somebody says that, tell me one single investigation which says that 100% diagnosis of a tumor, that is always histopathology. You have to do a tissue diagnosis. Next, these tumor markers are also helpful for prognosis and therapeutic value. Let us take an example. There's a choriocarcinoma. What it secretes? A lot of beta HCG. So you did beta HCG levels of the patient before operating the patient. It came 2 lakhs. Now you did curettage, all tumor removed from the endometrial cavity. Very good. Now after 7 days, you repeated this beta HCG levels and it came as 100. So it has drastically fallen down. Very good. So patient responded. After 6 months, again on the follow-up you did beta HCG. Now this came 50,000. Now you are taken aback. Something went wrong. What went wrong? The tumor has metastasized. Now let us do a scan of lung and you find some nodules in the lung. So the choriocarcinoma has metastasized to the lung. That's why it has again started secreting beta HCG. So now it becomes prognostically as well as therapeutically important. That how long I'm going to give the chemotherapy or I should stop. So what is ideal tumor marker? An ideal tumor marker is that which is secreted by each and every tumor. Means I say there are 100 patients of hepatocellular carcinoma, all should secrete it. That is one thing. Then its level of secretion should be stable. Second thing, it should not be easily biodegradable. Means it should remain in blood for some time so that we can check the levels. Fourth is that the levels of that marker should directly be associated with the bulk of tumor. Unfortunately, even today, there is no ideal tumor marker. There are limitations with all the tumor markers. And please mind well, not all tumors secrete tumor markers. So if I say that prostate-specific antigen is secreted by prostatic carcinoma, in reality only 50% of this carcinoma secrete PSA, 50% are non-secretors. Why so? The tumor which are poorly differentiated, high grade, they are not functioning. So naturally, they will not secrete that particular hormone or enzyme. That's why tumor markers are adjuvant and not a replacement for tissue diagnosis. But definitely they are handy. They help in many scenarios where tumor is in last stage, where you don't go for surgeries and all. So some examples of these tumor markers like beta HCG seen in trophoblastic tumors like choriocarcinomas, in non-seminal-matous testicular tumors, calcitonin, very peculiar medullary carcinoma of thyroid, catecholamines from pheochromocytomas, alpha-fetoproteins coming from liver cancers, CEA coming from CA colon, pancreas, lung, stomach and breast cancers. CEA stands for carcinoembryonic antigen. Then prostatic acid phosphatase and non-specific enolase. So prostatic acid phosphatase coming from prostatic cancer, PSA again coming from prostatic cancer, NSC from neuroblastomas, immunoglobulins, we all know. Your benzones proteins coming in multiple myelomas and plasma cell dyscrasias, mucins and glycoproteins like CA125 in ovarian tumors, CA19.9 for CA colon and pancreas, CA15.3 in breast cancers. So these are some of the examples of tumor markers, just to have an understanding of what they mean by tumor markers. Two more mechanisms and then we will finish with our tumor diagnosis. Flow cytometry. So what we did in immunochemistry was, on a tissue, the antigen was fixed. We took a section, we added an antibody, we added a second antibody with a dye, and we could tag it. If I do the same thing in a flow, means in a liquid form, it becomes a flow cytometry. So the mechanism remains same. Here again, you have antibodies against a particular antigen on a cell surface or nucleus, but now the cells are in a liquid form, means they are in blood. That's why flow cytometry will be applied mainly for blood cells, body fluids, bone marrow aspirations. So here you will detect the cell membrane antigens. So the best example are all the CD markers. So in short, all leukemias and lymphomas can be very well categorized by help of flow cytometry. So what we do exactly in flow cytometry? Let us understand that by a simple mechanism. So we take, for example, blood. So you have taken 2 ml of blood, EDTA blood. In that you have pour the antibodies which are tagged with fluorescent dye. Now these antibodies are very specific. So one type of antibody will bind only to CD4, another will bind to CD8, third will bind to CD20, fourth is binding to CD21. So one antibody, one antigen, or one CD receptor, right? Now we have mixture of such 3 to 5 antibodies within the blood. Incubate it for 45 minutes. So you have given room temperature, body temperature, it will bind to them, excess will be washed. Now we aspirate this in a flow cytometer where another fluid comes with that and it makes the cells to flow in a single linear fashion. Now when they are flowing in a single linear fashion, you impact a laser light over it. So when the laser light will fall on this cell, and if the cell has this antibody coated on it, it is having the fluorescent dye, it will emit a light of a particular wavelength, and that will be read by different kind of detectors which will detect different wavelengths of the light. So for example, I have tagged the CD8 with a blue light, the CD4 with a green light, CD20 with a yellow, and maybe CD21 with orange. So with every emittance of light, they will count it as one cell. So that will start cell sorting. So what it will give us at the end of 5 or 10 minutes, it will say that, okay, there are 1 lakh lymphocytes in this sample. Of this, 40% are CD4 positive, okay, 20% are CD8 positive, 60% or 40% are CD20 positive. So that is how it will help us to segregate the population of the cells. So now it is saying that 100% are CD20 positive. What does it mean? This is a B cell neoplasm. I hope you get this flow cytometry. Last are the molecular techniques. So molecular diagnosis, where what we had seen that in all the tumors there are some mutations, right? Either there are chromosomal abnormalities like translocations or inversions, okay, or deletions, means a particular segment of chromosome is lost, or it has inverted its position, or they have exchanged their parts of arms. So that will be studied with the help of karyotyping. So karyotyping basically is done to study large changes in the chromosomes, gross. But when there are changes only at the level of genes, so genes are very small, so that study cannot be done by karyotyping. So for that I need further molecular techniques to study the genes. So first in that is called FISH, fluorescent in situ hybridization. So here you will put a small DNA probe which is complementary to mutated gene, not the normal gene, only mutated variant. So this is done in vivo. So the cell, you have not lysed it. So you have introduced a probe in a form of small complementary DNA molecule which will go and bind only to the mutated gene. So if it binds and it fluoresces under the microscope, I know that, okay, the BCL-AB are present in this particular cell. I say it is positive for this mutation. Okay, but if there is no combination of mutant, it won't bind the normal. It will get washed off. So the slide will not fluoresce. So you will not get a signal. Similarly, for DNA RNA-based molecular techniques, we have southern blot for DNA analysis, northern blot for RNA analysis. PCR today is a very handy technique where each and every single gene can be studied. Okay, but what is the limitation of PCR? It takes more time, and in one go I may study maximum 4 to 5 gene mutations. But now if I want to study multiple mutations, then what is latest in this? That is called NGS, next generation sequencing. In simple language, here you analyze the whole human genome. So in one sitting, in 24 hours, with the help of very sophisticated softwares, you are going to study each and every gene in the genome. So in one go, you are going to say that, okay, this tumor cells, they have these mutations from growth promoting genes, from tumor suppressor genes, from apoptotic genes, from DNA repair genes. So you have studied the whole genome. Okay, and what is the use of studying this? These are used basically in research areas where we want to see what new mutations are developing in different tumors, so that what new treatment protocols are to be devised, how the tumors are becoming resistant to existing therapies, what new mutations they are requiring. So can we go for target therapies? So that is our futuristic approach. Okay, so NGS definitely is a costly affair, not affordable by masses, more helpful in research and more helpful to even know the new mutations which are not right now assigned with particular tumors. Okay, so in future, NGS will replace PCR, maybe just down the lane within 5 years. Of course, cost is one of the limiting constraints. So with that, I come to end to my series of neoplasia lectures, and I hope at least you got some insight in the tumors. So let us first proceed with the MCQs, and then I will come back to your questions. Yes. Hello. Ms. Martin, can we proceed with MCQs?
Okay, we'll be starting with the quiz now.
I think majority are correct. We can go to next question. Yes.
Please show the polls.
Yeah, majority are correct. Next one, please. People have got confused. That's why I had given a simple knack that there are only two RNA viruses causing cancers. One is hepatitis C, and another is STLV, human T lymphocytic viruses, lymphotrophic. Rest all are DNA viruses. So that way it will be easy to remember. So HTLV1 is the answer because that is RNA virus. Next one, please. Yes, poll please. Yeah, majority are correct. Type 16 again I had given an act that generally single digit are causing papillomas and double digit above 15 are causing carcinomas. Next one please. This poll please. Yeah, majority are correct. B lymphocyte. D for Burkitt. You can remember like that also. Next one. Yeah, majority are correct. Next one, please. Yeah, majority are correct.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so can I now proceed with answering your queries?
Yes, sir. Many queries are there today.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
students know that this is the last lecture. So
Yeah.
every
So
question
let me
has
start.
cases. Yes.
Yeah, let me start with the first query. That the query is a patient of small cell lung carcinoma is secreting adenocorticotropic hormone and presenting with Cushing syndrome. So please make it more clear. See, the thing is, we know that normally adenocorticotropic hormone will come from adrenals, right? Now adrenals are secreting their share. In addition, now there is a lung mass. Let us imagine it is 4 centimeter in size. That is not going to cause much of your respiratory difficulty because it is sitting in the parenchyma of the lung, unless it is sitting in the bronchus. Okay, so it is not giving any symptoms of the lung as such. Now, if it starts secreting excess of ACTH, which will supersede your adrenals also, so this excess of hormones are going to land up into syndrome, and we know that Cushing syndrome is associated with hyperadrenalism, right? And because of that, instead of coming with a lung mass symptoms, here the patient basically comes with weight gain and hump and moon-like face and all. And you try to relate it with adrenal, you do a sonography and you see that there's no increase in size of adrenal. Then you start searching for what should be the reason. And then you land up with a lung mass. That is what we mean by paraneoplastic syndromes to start with. That the patient may come with the symptoms of syndrome itself instead of coming with say coughing or wheezing or difficulty in breathing or hemoptysis, that is blood in his sputum, right? So I hope this is clear. I come to next question by Sajal, that he is asking that FNAC for diagnosis, won't it increase the risk of metastasis or can say spread to nearby lymph node? Now, if you remember the lecture where we had dealt with different routes of metastasis, the last route was called implantation, right? Where I had given a classic example that imagine there is a breast carcinoma. I did FNAC, I put a needle in that mass, and while coming back through the tract, right from skin to the mass, some of the cells, tumor cells, which were on the outer surface of the needle, may get implanted in this area right up the skin. And 1 in 1 lakh, they may get implanted, get nutrition and cause secondary satellite mass at the track of FNAC. Okay, that's what we mean by implantation. But at the same time, I had said that if at all it was cancer to start with, it needs either a chemotherapy or a radiation therapy or a surgery. So that's why till it forms a mass and it manifests as a satellite nodule, before that actually we will start with intervention. That's why we don't bother much about this, and also the incidence is very low. I come to next question, that is by Arya Sharma. Cervical cancers caused by sexually acquired infection like HPV. HPV is a STD, right? Causing cancer. So why we put cancers in the category of non-communicable disease? Now let me start with that. What do you mean by communicable disease? As an etiological agent passed from one person to another by different modes, maybe aerosol, fecal-oral or direct contact, and it leads to that infection in that other person or that disease 100%. Means it will cause infection and disease by transmission. That is what comes as communicable disease. Now coming to HPV, human papilloma virus is sexually transmitted, agreed. It infects the cells of genital areas, agreed. But it doesn't cause cancer in 100% patients to which it is transmitted. It causes poilocytosis, agreed. It is strongly associated with squamous cell carcinoma of genitals, agreed. But it doesn't say that all the people who got HPV will develop squamous cell carcinoma. It is one of the etiological factors which may develop into SCC. That's why, and that too in future. How? By first leading to mutations that will go on accumulating. There will be add-on estrogen effect, add-on some infective effect, add-on some ulcer effect, and then there will be developing into cancer. That's why straightaway you cannot call it a communicable disease. Coming to next question again by Sajal, is asking that if trophoblastic tumor is metastasized to lung, then will it secrete beta HCG there also? That is the beauty of tumors. That if a tumor is secreting some kind of hormone or enzyme or a tumor marker, Wherever it goes and lodges and causes a secondary nodule, again it will keep on secreting. That's what I said, that if there's a prostatic carcinoma, it secreted PSA, you removed prostate, it metastasized to spine, again PSA is coming in blood. That gives me indication that there is some metastatic nodule. Okay, so it will definitely lead to that. Your question is, then how do you conclude that this is metastatic? Because I know that beta HCG, to start with, there was a tumor in the uterus, got operated, and now again it is secreting beta HCG and there's a nodule in lung. So I can relate these two threads. Okay. So that's all, and thanks a lot for attending all this lecture series, and I hope to some extent it has benefited you. Thank you.
The other questions are also there. Is it possible in any case that a tumor metastasizes but there is no clinical features?
Yeah, definitely. See, definitely. That's what I said. Let's suppose, let us take, there's a gastric cancer, right? And it has formed 3 or 4 small nodules in the liver. Now, unless it blocks your major hepatic radicals or bile ducts, it is not going to cause jaundice. Unless it damages a lot of hepatocytes, it is not going to raise your bilirubin or SGPTs or SGUTs. So patient is not going to come with hepatitis like symptoms. So this will go completely unnoticed. There is a prostatic tumor, it has metastasized to the spine bone, but the nodules are very small. So what they have done, they have not caused pathological fracture. So it will not cause any symptom. But if it grows to a larger size, it collapses your disc. There's a disc collapse, it compresses your spinal cord. Patient comes with neurological symptoms. Then it will be symptomatic. So when the metastatic nodules are small in size, they are not secreting anything and they are not causing much damage to the organ of metastasis, they can go completely unnoticed. And that's why what we need whole body scanning to clinically stage the tumor, which I had told it during clinical staging of tumor. That is the importance of whole body scanning. That's why we should not undermine radiological investigation, thinking that, okay, I can obviously see a primary tumor, let me operate this, then we will later on go for scanning. Because I may completely miss an occult metastasis.
So, and the last question. Sir, what is 2-hit hypothesis in familial retinoblastoma?
What is 2-hit
hypothesis in familial retinoblastoma?
See, familial retinoblastoma, that's what I said. Very few tumors are familial, okay? Or very few tumors are inherited. So in inherited tumors, what is the problem? Now, what is retinoblastoma gene? It is a gene of category of tumor suppressor genes, right? So when I say I have removed a tumor suppressor gene, it is no more inhibiting the growth or proliferation of a cell. And even a single mutation in my growth promoter gene is occurring because of, say, free radical injury or oxidative stress. So that was just one mutation acquired after birth. But problem is, one mutation was already present. They team up and they start forming a neoplastic cell. So that's why they will have a very strong association of tumor formations, because their first line of defense is already lost. They are carrying an inherited mutation.
Okay, sir, I think no more questions in the series. I hope all students have been benefited by these lecture series, and the best part is that you have explained each and everything very briefly, nicely explained. You have given mnemonics to remember also, sir. I think this is the simplest way of teaching this tough topic, and I think that all students who have attended full series, they can go through it, they can revise it on our Medvis channel. And those who have not followed any of the lectures, they can also go back and subscribe to the channel and they can view the series. So I think, sir, we should end the meeting now.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much for these full lectures. Okay, hope sir, we'll join us again for another topic, in the difficult topic of students of choice, whatever they feel.
Okay.
So this is the last lecture of neoplasia, and all of them who are following, they would have definitely been benefited by this. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.